Hi guys, Robert J. E. Simpson here once again. Today as I record this is the 2nd of June 2020, and if you watched yesterday's video, you'll see I was talking about Will Hammer and talking about the origins of Hammer films and this alternate history that I think exists. If you think that Hammer is only about horror films, then you're missing out on a vast array of interesting material. So I'm going to maybe do a few more videos on that. Today, I'm going to touch on another one of sort of the early Hammer products, and I'll show you a couple of things they have in my archive from that. There's also a little bit of a political tinge to today's talk, and a bit of a history lesson. So bear with me. I'm not trying to preach to anyone, but there is some stuff that's going to come through as well. So it's not just all about line to entertainment. I promised I would do this actually a number of weeks ago, and I hadn't got around to it. But I want to talk about the third film that Hammer did. This is a film called Song of Freedom, made in 1936 as a Hammer British Lion co-production. And it's really interesting, basically because its star has been in my mind. Well, not because of, but really interesting. And the star of this has been in my mind for the last couple of weeks, basically in light of what's been happening across the way in the United States at the moment. So, Song of Freedom is pretty special because of its star, and it stars none other than Paul Robeson, who was a great, phenomenal actor and a singer with a wonderful, booming voice that conveys just such passion and strength and is just amazing. But it's really quite interesting because Hammer picked him at a point when this was something that wasn't really done. This is only like their third film, and they have a black leading actor at a time when this didn't happen. Robeson is in fact the first African-American man who is given the star billing for a motion picture film, and he makes only about a dozen films in his career, but they are all well worth watching. There is an awful lot to be gleaned from his films, from his actual career itself. So Robeson starts his life in 1898. He is born in New Jersey, the son of a former slave. His mum dies when he's 6 years old, and in spite of these really difficult sort of origins, he keeps on succeeding and basically progressing with his life. He is a phenomenon both academically, artistically, and also on the sports field. So he gains all sorts of recognition for his sportsmanship. Academically, he ends up going to the Columbia Law School, which he graduates from, so he can add lawyer to his skills. And then his singing voice got him the attention, and he ended up working on theatre and then on film. And he comes to Britain in the 1930s, and he's here for a number of years. And I think it's really interesting that they picked him for that particular film, and I suppose I'll show you some stuff before I continue the lecture. So I've got these. These are a couple of original bits of sheet music for Song of Freedom, released to tie in with the film, so you can actually learn how to play the music that's in the film. This is what they did back then. Don't do it so much today, but I love how he basically takes star prominence in these. Phenomenal. They also released a record later on of his songs from the film. I think it was a like 1950s re-release that they did, but I have about 4 or 5 copies of that somewhere. I keep on picking them up, I don't know why. But I just love his voice, and I love what he's doing. Now, the films that he does, Song of Freedom, he basically plays this dock worker who ends up discovering that he comes from a great deal of an important African tribe, and during the filming he comes over to Britain, and then they instantly go out to Sierra Leone and they film out there for a number of weeks, basically getting footage of him and amongst the native culture. It was really, really expensive, but really, really worthwhile. And so a lot of I suppose we would probably look at it today and think there's a little bit of quite a bit of cultural stereotyping within this, but it is also fascinating to see somebody who comes from this dispossessed family reconnecting with the culture of the past. And he gives his performance, there's a lot of poignancy and strength, and he himself is never really demeaned in it. Now, he would give up on his acting career on screen because he felt that the film roles that he was getting weren't really suitable for him, that they were sort of stereotyped, that they were lazy, and that they no longer represented him in the way that he wished to be represented, which, quite honestly is fair enough. But whilst he's in Britain, spending several years here, he becomes really politically motivated and interested in the plight of the underdog. He becomes very interested in the British working class, and sort of the difficulties that they're going through, and he becomes a great trade unionist. He also is fascinated and interested in the plight of those who were part of the British Empire, the native people in the British Empire who've basically been dispossessed and treated badly by the Brits as they've kind of come through the world. So he starts fighting for equal rights for them and campaigning on their behalf as well. And he basically is very much of socialist leanings. He believes in equality, and this is something he pushes for increasingly. And you see it reflected in some of the film choices that he makes as well on that time. You know, the social importance keeps on coming to the fore. That's something I admire a lot about him. In the 1940s, he sets up, in response to a series of very, very brutal, horrible lynchings of Black Americans, he sets up an anti-lynching league, a campaign group to try and stop the lynchings that are happening. And he goes to President Truman at the time, and he asks of him, on behalf, representing a whole swathe of people, he asks if it would be, he asks the government to intervene and to set up legislation in order to stop the lynchings. And he says to Truman somewhat ominously, if you don't, the people will. And I'm struck by just how relevant that seems at the moment and what's happening in the United States. I'm seeing friends and family, seeing friends out there who are out protesting, who are going through the experiences, who are out there on the marches, who are part of the communities that are being affected by this, and just feeling very, very aware and connected to that. It's ultimately a question about equality. And whilst I come from the privilege of a very, very white country, I live in Northern Ireland, and this is predominantly white. So I haven't had, and that's what I am. So I haven't had to deal with those kind of issues. But it doesn't mean I can't empathise or feel. And it's no point me giving a lecture, because like I'm in a position where this is not appropriate for me to give you a lecture about how someone should feel, but I can just recognise stuff that has gone on. In this country, we have had our own civil unrests. We've had the people turn against the state. We've had the people turn against the people. We've had people locked up and persecuted for no reason other than just because of where they lived, because of their religion, because of their name. It is something that happens, and these sort of I'm very, very aware at the moment. I feel I might get political for a second. That these sort of unrest can build up and sort of bloom, and I think that we're possibly on the brink of something. This happened in the 1960s. Not only was the civil marches happening in America and the campaign for black rights, but also there were other similar movements within Europe, within France, within here in Northern Ireland, and things have just blown up again. And my own experiences here, I've been in situations where there have been riots going on around me not as a participant, but someone who's been sort of in that place at that time, and it's not pleasant. And it's quite terrifying. Like America, I live in a country where the police are armed. So there's always that risk that someone's going to cause something. It's quite a terrifying prospect. So Robeson's words and his actions have just been playing through my head a lot. And I posted part of this story up in Cinepunk yesterday, but I wanted to be able to elaborate it on my own feed and within my own kind of context. So in 1946 he campaigns, and in fact lynching legislation still hasn't been passed in the United States. It finally got passed the House of Representatives earlier this year. This is well over 70 years later, nearly 80 years later. So legislation finally passed the House of Representatives. It's thought it should pass the Senate at some point soon, but obviously with everything up in the air as it is at the moment, this hasn't happened yet. But it is ridiculous to think that this is still going on. decades later that they're still having to fight, still having to campaign, still having to try and make a difference. And when Robeson leaves Truman, he heads off. The first thing they do, the guards stop him and they ask him, is he a communist? And this is the kiss of death in America, you know, at that time in the 40s and 50s. This is a label that keeps on getting put on Robeson because of his socialist leanings, because his desire to see people treated equally, which seems to be, to me, to be a perfectly normal human rights issue. It's not about anything else, but this is what happened. And he said that no, he was not a communist, but that he regarded himself as very violently anti-fascist. And again, this struck me in light of stuff that's been said this week. He was an anti-fascist. He also said that if you were for the people, then you're basically a socialist. But he said if you were against the people, you were a fascist. And at that point, he felt that America and Britain were particularly fascistic. This was just after the Second World War, and lessons were still being learned. And he found it really, really galling that America was very involved in the Nuremberg trials and persecuting the Nazis for the persecutions that they had perpetrated, while at the same time at home in the United States they were completely disregarding the plight of their own people. And again, this seems to me to be very, very relevant to what's happening and the debate that's happening right now. I suppose if we look at this week's change in terminology, you know, because he's an anti-fascist, he would be part of the anti-fascist movement. Therefore, Robeson himself would have been regarded as a terrorist, and he basically did get labelled that way. The House of Un-American Activities Committee took him in for questioning in the 1950s. They took away his passport, and he basically refused to engage with their questions. He knew that he was being manipulated and used, and I find him very, very powerful as a figure, and in the way that he was able to hold himself up and be so political and be so strong in spite of everything, and to use the power that he had. There is a point where he actually gives concerts in England and Wales, packing out halls, and he is not allowed to leave the United States, so he does them down a phone line. Bear in mind, this is not 2020. The technology is very different. This is not possible. But he does it down a phone line, and it's then broadcast to these rooms. This is the solidarity that in Britain and Wales, in England and Wales, that they felt with him because of what he had done here for the people all those years earlier. He comes to Northern Ireland as well, but that's a conversation for another day. So he is finding a way around it. He is working in the system, and he is constantly trying to fight so that people can be heard. In 1958, he eventually gets given his passport back, but he never ceases campaigning. He never ceases fighting for equality, and it's equality and recognition that were hugely important. I mean, he lived long enough to see the equal rights being issued finally in the 1960s. In the United States, he died in, I think it was 1976. So really, really important figure, lots and lots of really hard work, and his speeches, his power, the words that he says in the 40s and the 50s and the 30s are just as relevant today. And I've seen a lot of people quoting people like Martin Luther King in recent weeks, and it just strikes me that before MLK, these things were an issue. After MLK, they were an issue. They remain an issue today. And at some point we have to stop and we have to listen to what's being said and look at the real meat of the problem and then try and address it. This is about as political as I'm likely to get on these little videos, unless something absolutely disastrous happens and I feel really, really like I need to talk. I try to avoid politics in these sort of records, but I think it's interesting. It's also interesting, I think, how film history, people think like, you're interested in film, what's the point? The cultural history that we have and the people that represent those cultural histories give us a voice. They give us an indication of what's going on in the time. They use film as a way to make their voices heard, to engage in the conversations, to stimulate the debates. And Robeson did that. Robeson's reworking of the Negro spiritual songs that came about from the slave communities. He reworks them, he gives them a new voice, and it's the voice of a liberation. It's this reappropriation. It's something that, it's this real sense of identity and pride, and I just cannot help but be in awe of that man and that legacy that he has left behind. And I love the fact that little old Hammer films back in the 1930s had the sense to do that, to go and cast this wonderful talent and present him here and make him completely accessible. Not only that, they also included amongst with the cast was also Elizabeth Welch, who was of mixed parentage, and this love affair between these two couples, but also it does talk about sort of the racist elements that do exist at the time and that perception, and that is really useful to see as well, because again, this stuff hasn't completely gone away. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to talk about today. I just wanted to kind of want to talk a little bit about my interest in sort of the early Hammer stuff, and also to share some of my collection, but also as a way of engaging with this conversation, this debate right now. One of the things that's talked about on social media is it's really important, and if you're wanting to get involved in this issue at the moment, and it's not a case of just looking at, everybody's life is important, but right now this is an issue that's specifically about Black America specifically, although it's a wider issue about racism, and that is a global problem. It's definitely a problem here in Ireland. Anyone who says that it isn't paying attention, and it's definitely a problem in England. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've heard the comments that are being made. It is definitely an issue within these countries. So it is an issue about racism, and the best thing for you to do and standing up for it, we can't remain silent. We have to speak up. We have to say that this isn't right. And as a white person, it's my duty to tell my friends and my family that, racism isn't right. Your racist attitudes are not right, and to use what limited platform I have to try and make a difference. And it's also really important to try and educate myself, and it's also really important that you try and educate yourselves, to try and learn a little bit more about the culture, to learn a little bit more what the fundamental issues are. And actually, you know what, if it helps, if what you need to gain an appreciation for what is going on is to look at your own community and their own history and their own subjugations, look at that. You will see this stuff has happened before for you, and how your own communities have often struggled, whether it's the Jewish community, or if it's the Irish community, whatever, you will find that they're the working class. This is what I love about Robeson. Robeson sort of is this much wider issue, and it's not just about colour, it is about class, it is about equality, and that's what it is. And I guess that in America, socialism is often seen as a bad word, but it's not a bad thing. And this video may well end up resulting in me not getting back over the States anytime soon, which would be a shame. But I think it's important that I address it and I acknowledge it and I put myself on record, and just to say that this is someone that, for me, this is someone I admire, and as a narrator, as a thinker, and if you've never ever come across his work, go out and explore it. Apologies, folks. This has been a little bit more of a little bit longer than I normally expect to do these things, but I think it's an important issue, and hopefully it conveys a little bit about the man. I can't even do him justice. But yeah, we will talk again. I'll be back at some future date, and I may well show you some more stuff from the archive, and just stay safe, whatever you're doing out there. You find me as usual. All the social media links are coming up just at the end here. Click on them, find them, go and explore, and hopefully talk to you again